Welcome to our show this morning. Anita is away and she is replaced by the unreplaceable or irreplaceable John Case. Welcome, John.
Oh, glad to be here, Joe.
And good morning, Rosanna and
Good morning.
Scott. Well,
Morning.
folks, we got a lot to talk about today. Bernie Sanders wrote a big, long article in The Nation, which we're going to be talking about on capitalism. Interesting piece, well written, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. The president of Mexico is going to lead an international campaign to finally, we hope, end the embargo of Cuba. Uh, we not only wish him luck, but we know that we have a role to play in making that happen. I'm sure everybody here would agree with that. And then finally, um, we want to talk a little bit about what happened very close to where I was born and raised in East Palestine, Ohio. I was about 15 miles, 20 miles from Youngstown. Big train derailment, and there's a lot of criticism about the response of government and also the responsibility of the corporation that was directing those trains across the Pennsylvania border into Ohio. And then finally, we're going to be talking about our mailbag. Rosanna, let's get started. You know, when I was a younger person and still had hair, the YCL made a T-shirt, and on the front of the T-shirt were two words, which became very popular: "Capitalism sucks." And I was reminded about that when I read this article by Senator Sanders in The Nation the other day. The title of which is Anti-Union Capitalism is Wrecking America. Rosanna, is there such a thing as pro-union capitalism?
I don't
Is
think
your,
so.
hmm,
I mean, I heard someone who's running against Feinstein, the senator for California, saying something about making capitalism better. We have to make the right capitalism. Well, there's no right capitalism for workers because there's still capitalism still exploiting workers at some point, at some level or another. So, no, I don't think so. There is no right in capitalism for the workers. There's changing capitalism to socialism. That's what's best for the workers, in my opinion.
John Case, Sanders spends a lot of time talking about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and what a great president he was, and
Right.
how he was dreaming of the New Deal, and how 31, 32% of the working class in the United States were in unions during that time, and how there was a closer relationship between, on the one side, worker productivity, and on the other side, um, worker wages. And I think that I think rather explicit point that he was trying to make is that uh, capitalism can do better than what it's doing now, and that in that sense, there's a can be a pro-union capitalism. What do you think?
I think there could be a pro-union capitalism. That would be the capitalist part of a socialist-led economy. Um, and I think political revolutions and political changes can be profound and be cataclysmic, but economic change for the whole people is almost always incremental. So, yes, a communist or socialist-led economic program would include a private sector for a long time yet to come. And the experiences of socialist countries has proved that. But the question is, where does the public sector going to expand? Where are the socialist values going to grow? How is it going to, how are you going to get not only a railroad system that doesn't dump chemicals, but a modern one that solves transportation problems and the investments? So, yeah, I think you can have market forces behave productively if they're led by communists.
if they're
Definitely.
led by a communist. But Scott Hiley, I mean, there's the a drive for corporate maximum profits, and then there's the demand and imperative of workers having to fight to earn enough to live and reproduce. So isn't that like water and oil coming together and clashing and and so while you can win with reforms, isn't it ultimately the case that you got to overthrow the damn thing?
Ultimately, of course. I mean, when it comes down to it, there's working class power and there's capitalist power. You can't have both at the same time. And this idea of a pro-union capitalism, yes, there are conditions where the capitalist class in various countries has been um, forced to accept uh, um, a certain loss of power to organize labor, has been forced to accept constraints on its ability to pursue maximum profits. There's situations where capital, like the New Deal, for example, where the capitalist class has been uh, put in a position of having to make concessions. But unions are about the power of the working class to decide its own working conditions, its own wages, and that is something that at the bottom is um, incompatible uh, with capitalist power. Um, so ultimately, no, there is no pro-union capitalism. There are reforms under capitalism to increase the power of labor, like the PRO Act, which is an urgent necessity that I hear a lot of talk about, but not much action on. Uh, but um, but in the long run, no.
Rosanna, Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, and he believes in democratic socialism. But there is not now one word in that article about socialism. Um, he says everything but socialism. I wonder why that's the case. You think he's getting a little scared of the Republican and Democratic, at least the center of the Democratic parties. They passed that resolution a couple of days ago where they condemned, everything from uh, uh, Saint Saint Thomas Aquinas to Karl Marx uh, to Bernie Sanders and AOC. You think he just doesn't think it's palatable, or is anybody's guess why he didn't mention the word socialism?
Well, I can only speculate why. Uh, Part of it, I think, is probably because of this whole the word socialism. Just like the word communism is, they're attempting to make it into something that's bad, and so but I think that sometimes if you lay out the plan and then you introduce the term, might work better for people who aren't familiar with the concepts and stuff like that. And what he laid out, was pretty good. Um, but he did fall short of calling it socialism. Maybe in his next article, he can point that out as this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're for. But
We'll write him a letter and make that recommendation. John Case, he calls for four basic things in the article. One, create a full employment economy in which every worker is entitled to a decent job. Strengthen the trade union movement. Empower, that's number two. Strengthen the trade union movement. Empower workers. Make unions a genuine counterbalance to corporate power. Three, remove barriers to worker ownership. Get rid of them and increase the presence of workers on the boards of corporations that are privately owned. Four, address the reality that tech change is rapidly transforming the nature of work, and and as a result, that we have to make sure that these sweeping changes benefit ordinary Americans and not just the 1%. Do you agree with those four things, number one? And is there anything
Yeah.
you would add?
Well, that's a socialist program. When you talk about a full employment economy, that's a socialist program because capitalism doesn't provide full employment. And I think it's a mistake however, in economic terms, to sharply distinguish, all class relations in trying to define a socialist message, which I think Bernie does. I mean, the ingredients of a socialist program would be exactly those things, and plus a number of others, right, that you could add to it. He, but the question is that you have to put forward a concept of socialism that embraces, a lengthy reform period only led by a different class, social class. China hasn't abolished private industry. The Soviet Union never did either. They seized the commanding heights. They talked about nationalization and national control more than individual workers, sitting on the boards of directors of companies. Although I think that's an important social democratic reform. I'm sure that's positive. It's all positive. But the key thing is who's got control of the commanding heights of the economy. Period. And what class of people, what coalition is directing that thing? That's the key socialist towards socialism, more socialism transition that we need.
Okay. Well, Scott, do you agree with John? Is are all
Uh,
of those basic elements of a socialist program? And is there anything you would like to add?
Well, I think John is right on in his insistence that it's not about just getting workers onto the boards of corporations. That that is one way of giving workers some pull, some weight, a seat at the table, quite literally. But what we're really talking about is putting the working class as a class in control of the economy, and that means insofar as there is some private ownership, market controlled sector, whatever, that the tyranny of the market is kind of circumscribed, right? It has to find its place within the overall structure of working class power, of solidarity, that is dictated by socialism. I would say that I'm especially interested in the idea about technology, and this has been going on for a long time, right? We've had massive changes to how production works that have largely worked to screw over the working class, to destroy good jobs and replace them with lower wage ones, to grow the gig economy, and it's time to um, put these technologies to work for the good of the people and the good of the working class, not just, or instead of, in fact, the good of the owners of the technology. But that's something. I mean, that's going to require expropriation. It's going to require taking the rights, the control of certain kinds of technology away from private corporations and giving them to the people via nationalization. There's no, there's not much way around that as I see it.
Rosanna, you know, um, one of the things that struck me about Sanders' excellent article is that it kind of focuses too much, at least in my opinion, on change from above, um, how great FDR was, but he doesn't really say much about, except by implication, the movement that existed in the 30s that made what FDR stood for possible, that pushed FDR, that compelled him and his administration to enact radical reforms. And as we keep saying, without that kind of movement from below, you know, I'm not sure how those four propositions that he put forward: a full employment economy, strengthen the trade union movement, remove barriers to worker ownership, get control, technological. I'm not sure how that's possible without, for example, radically reforming the political system. You know what I mean? And that's not possible without a movement from below.
That's very true. I think he missed that because he fully understands the power of the movement and the power of people gathering and uniting against an issue. I mean, the fact that he was elected, even with his in is it Vermont? I think it is,
Vermont,
or
yes.
yeah, as mayor and then representative in Vermont from Vermont, with his ideas shows that it was the power of the movement, is the people who elected him, the people, what agree with what he's saying, and it's the people who elected him. It's the people who have been behind him. It's the people who have allowed him to stay in office with those ideas that he has. So I think he either made an assumption or you know really fails to see the full importance of that. I mean, it's key. That's the key to anything, is joining forces and making demands, but you have to organize it. You can't just demand it. It has to be organized.
John Case, I'm being a little bit unfair because Bernie, he understands, Rosana's right. He understands mass movements because
He
he led
certainly
one.
did.
He led
He's,
one. He led one. And he's
right.
probably still leading one. I mean, there were three mass movements in the last 2 or 3 election cycles. One led by Barack Obama, one led by Trump on the right, one led by Bernie, one led by Elizabeth Warren. Mrs. Warren's kind of petered out at a certain point, but nevertheless, there was a lot of momentum around her campaign. And Bernie kind of hints at it at the end of the article, the last 2 paragraphs, the last of which he starts quoting Eugene Debs again, and the example of the latent power and strength of working people rising up and taking control of our lives. And that's a good thing. But I was also struck that the article was, as good as it was silent, John Case, on international policy, with the exception of talking about the disaster NAFTA was and how it created the circumstances where big sections of the working class uh, uh, moved away from the Democratic Party. And I'm just wondering, what, uh, you know, good on domestic policy, but not so great on international U.S. foreign policy.
I think Bernie's weakness and the weakness of his socialism has always been, if he has one, okay, I'm not, Bernie's been a friend and a friend of our union too in hard times. But he's you can't confront and approach the question of socialism, of the commanding heights of political reform that you talked about, Joe, if you do not confront the issue of imperialism and the domination foreign policy of our country. And because there's an internationalist, globalization is just the objective reflection of it. The whole world is watching. It's in motion. It's imperial policies are not going to lead to prosperity for either the world or the American people. And every step forward, reform-wise, will be compromised by the losses and the blowback from imperial policies. And so that internationalism, AMLO, for example, does not agree that NAFTA was the same level of problem that Bernie does, just for example. Okay. And, so there's a long way to go. I think that we have an important role to play in trying to strengthen internationalism, both within our country, all the different nationalities and races that are now engaged here, and also globally find ways to demonstrate that. Because the big risk to everything, it thinks, is a weakness on imperialism can wipe out not just the approach to socialism in real life, but can wipe out liberalism as well, because they get sucked into it almost as bad as the Trumpers. So anyway, that's just my feeling on that.
And sometimes worse. Brings us to the next point, U.S. policy towards Cuba, Rosanna. I mean, you know, Trump put in place 23, 34, I forget the number, of additional uh, restrictions on trade and having economic relationships with Cuba. And the country is just almost being strangled to death, you know? Uh, and now President Obrador of Mexico is calling for leading an international campaign to end the embargo. And that's a big thing when a country like Mexico takes a stand like that. A lot of obstacles from the big banks and corporations, from the governments of the United States and Western Europe, but it's an admirable push that he's making.
Very much so. You know, he understands and he saw the value of the contributions that Cuba has made. During the pandemic, they were the only country that supplied them with the necessary vaccines and the necessary doctors that Mexico needed in order to get through the heavy part of the pandemic. But not only just that, there's many other examples of how Cuba has stepped up, immediately sends doctors, immediately sends any kind of aid, even though the country is, like you said, being strangled. They continually show the solidarity, and it's unconditional, not like in the US where we say, okay, we're going to help you with this, but you have to do this for us, kind of a thing. In Cuba, it's unconditional. And Cuba has a lot to offer the world, especially in the form of medicine that the world is being denied because of this embargo, because of this list being put on this terrorist list. And so we should join with the Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, and calling for an end to the blockade and calling for the removal of Cuba from the terrorist list. It's inhumane, and you're right. The people of Cuba are being strangled, and once again, it's very, very inhumane.
Scott, there's no basis for putting Cuba on this list. That's a political on the terrorism list. It's a
Absolutely. And you know, it's really galling, the kind of bad faith of the U.S. position, the position of the U.S. ruling class on Cuba, and on socialist countries in general. Because if you look at this anti-socialism resolution that the House just passed, it acts as if, you know, the benefits of capitalism are manifest, self-evident, obvious to everybody, and of course everyone agrees that socialism is, you know, a horrible dystopia, whatever. But every time a country chooses to take a socialist path, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in China, in the German Democratic Republic and the Soviet Union when they existed, there has been a concerted attempt to undercut, to destroy, to strangle that experiment, because capitalism knows that it can't compete. It can't provide the same kind of benefits, the same kind of progress for working people that socialism can. And what it reminds me most of is the attack of the right on public schools in this country, where you undercut, you chip away, you defund, and then you point the finger and say, "Oh, look, you know, the public schools are failing." Yeah, after you made a concerted effort to destroy them for 40 years, right? It's the same thing that the blockade has been doing to Cuba: strangle, 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 and then, you know, every time somebody in Cuba tries to, you know, leave for the United States, or you know, complains about the lack of basic goods or whatever, you know, use that as evidence that, yeah, it's just it's completely a galling level of bad faith, and it I think should anger any kind of rational, right-thinking person.
John Case, and it reminds us that the U.S. Administration, Mr. Biden's administration, uh, they just might want to pay a little bit more attention to things that are going on in the United States, like on the Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania border, and not to worry about so much what's going on 90 miles from Miami, because there was a terrible accident, and people are very, including your senator, Mr. Manchin, very critical that it took 2 weeks, apparently, for the big guns to come from Washington, D.C., which really ain't that far.
No.
It's about 2 hour drive or something like that to East Palestine, maybe three. How would you grade the administration's response to what happened in East Palestine?
Well, I think if they could go back and revisit the labor agreement that they imposed upon the railroad workers, they might think twice now um, about the overall safety concerns and welfare concerns of the unions. Um, this has happened. This is not an isolated circumstance. I mean, this has happened numerous times in West Virginia. And there was a whole crisis around the transport of fracked gas products because if the cars were banging against the rails in a certain way, a spark could come up and get more volatile reactions. So, I mean, the case is now, here's a perfect case of where a socialist solution, which is to take national control of the railroads. Our country did this, by the way, during World War I, in order, because to get it up to speed to meet the demands of transportation. Now, they sold it back to the private companies after the war was over. But, it's an imminent right now, for example, it is not possible for Amtrak to get from New York to Chicago in under 19 and a half hours. And the same distance from Beijing to Shanghai, or same thing as in Japan on 2 points, you can do it same distance in 4 hours and 10 minutes. And that's a difference in technologies, and the fact that you have 200-car freight trains that are going around, and they end up occupying areas where there's not enough two-track distance to have them be separate. And so the passenger trains have to stop and wait an hour for a 200-car train to pass. So you have these problems all over the country. It's a perfect case for a national program of reconstruction and taking national control of the railroad system to upgrade it and to take the workers' concerns about safety and staffing, put them on the front page.
I took that train, and one of the reasons is that you got to go. I'm sorry. You got to go all the way up to Albany, and you got to go across New York State. Then you got to go back down around Lake Erie, into Ohio, and then across. And I want that fast train, that 4 hour train. That 19 hours is crazy, and it's not even that much of a scenic route. In any event, let's move on to our mailbag question. Uh, and I do want to make one point. The railway workers called for 15 sick days. They compromised and said they would agree to 7. There were several dozen members of Congress, led by Bernie and AOC and Ilhan and Rashida Tlaib and others, Cori Bush, who demanded that the Biden administration intervene and use whatever power it has by executive order and to grant those sick days. And the pressure is building on the railroad corporations, and 2 or 3 of them have made some significant advances in the granting some of those sick days. Not 7, some 3, 4, but the pressure is building. So we have to continue to fight for that. We got to continue to keep the pressure on. It's really, really important. So to our mailbag. In interesting question this week. I agree with just about every plank in the party program. But I am concerned that if in power, the party would turn a blind eye to Chinese human rights abuses. What is the CPUSA's policy towards clear, unequivocal human rights abuses in socialist countries? Scott?
Well, let me start with the question of, our experience as communists of supposedly clear human rights abuses in socialist countries. When I traveled to Cuba for the first time, so I grew up in the United States, stuffed with all of the anti-Cuba, anti-socialist, anti-communist propaganda about tyranny, about the lack of freedom, about human rights abuses. And when I got to Cuba, it was sort of immediately apparent that it was all bullshit, right? When you had, so yes, I saw police come out to demonstrations, but they were protecting people demonstrating against the Cuban government from Cubans who would have otherwise tried to shut them down, right? There's not, so what there's a, it's part of the ruling class strategy of discrediting and undermining socialism is to spread lies about human rights abuses, about the treatment of political prisoners or whatever. Does that mean that every socialist country has been perfect on human rights in every case? No. But it does mean that we can't trust the US ruling class and the bourgeois media to tell us, what's actually happening in socialist countries, because they lie consistently.
They lie consistently. Rosanna, if the party comes to power, are we going to ignore human rights abuses in China or Argentina or Iceland?
Yeah.
Well, I'm with Scott. I think we first have to really make sure that there is such a thing. I've only heard these kinds of accusations by mainstream media about Chinese human rights abuses. So I tend not to believe it. I think the first thing we have to dig deeper and find out the history of what's happening, find out what is actually happening, and even to the point of going over there and really getting the full picture. That's the Marxist analysis of things. You have to look deeper. You have to get the full picture before you jump to conclusions, and then you work. You deal with it as you find whatever is really true. But I think the question makes an assumption that there are Chinese human rights abuses, and we don't know that for sure. We don't know that, and so we have to first explore that area first and foremost.
John Case, there's an implicit assumption in the article that China is the main violator of human rights on the planet today. Is that the case?
I think anybody who bothers to look at the newspapers of the United States and look at the incarceration rate, which exceeds that of every other country, certainly China, and also at the mass murders that take place both at police hands and just in the chaos of inequality and dysfunction in the United States. I'm not sure the reader read as many of the planks in the party program as he says. Because if you read the very first planks, and the commitment to internationalism, well, then you are not going to be the first to criticize others when there is blood spattered all over the front pages of your country. And I think to lecture, the incitement to lecture some other country about their human rights abuses when the abuses that are taking place here are, I don't think there's much doubt, are intolerable and are undefensible. So, we obviously we oppose. I've always opposed human abuses everywhere, but the point is that how would anybody in China, knowing the record of the United States on these abuses, ever respect their opinion being lectured by them without an admission also of mutual problems, if there are some? So I just the whole attitude, of the liberal or the mainstream media lecturing everybody in the world about why it would just be heaven if we all just everybody in the world had a Republican and Democratic Party and everybody else just shut the hell up. So I just, I can't even read those articles. They drive me nuts. I just don't believe. I don't know whether it's true.
With you,
But that's,
John.
The party will come to power in this country as part of a coalition in which there is a working class led social and democratic revolution that puts human dignity and human rights and human equality on the front row. Period. And when that happens, and when U.S. imperialism is stopped, prevented from interfering in every country in the world, when the CIA is dismantled and the Pentagon is shut down and a school, a great, beautiful university and cultural institution is put in its place, and when there's a radical reform of policing in this country so that Black and Latino men and women and trans people aren't murdered regularly every day. The number of people murdered by the cops has gone up every year since George Floyd has been killed, was murdered. He wasn't killed, he was murdered. Breonna Taylor, murdered. A young man in the South the other day, murdered. Cops. When all of that stops, it's going to have an effect on the whole planet. And every country and the forms of government will change. And because, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the U.S. government and ruling class is the main purveyor of war and violence in the world today. I'm not so concerned about, I'm for human rights. I'm against the death penalty, wherever it's employed. It's barbaric. But let's deal with what's taking place in this country. That's our first responsibility. And when that happens, our internationalism will help end whatever problems exist in other places. And with that, we're going to wish our listening audience a great weekend. Until next week, stay strong, stay safe, stay in the fight, take care, and we'll see you next Friday. John, thanks for joining us.
All right,
Bye,
thanks,
Russell.
Jeff.
Bye, everybody.
And thanks to our good producers.
Yes.